Good afternoon. I am Heather Herring, the Education Manager at the Northeast Resource Recovery Association. I want to warmly welcome you to our summer webinar series. Today, we explore the 6th R, Cultivating a Culture of Repair. Do you need professional credits? You can receive 1 hour professional development credit by participating in this live webinar and completing the short survey at the end. Our webinars are being recorded and will make available for those who registered. Continue your learning with these webinars all summer long. Please visit our new website at nrrarecycles.org for additional information. For our operator tracks, we have information on our webinars. We have operator track from which to choose from. And for our educators, we have administrators and community members. We have our community member webinars. We've separated our webinars according to probable interest groups, but all NRRA members and not yet members are welcome to participate in any and all of our webinar offerings. I'd like to set the table for GoToWebinar. Webinar participants will not be able to be heard by the presenters or other participants during this presentation. If you cannot hear the presenters' voices, please click the audio arrow in your control panel and choose computer audio. If that does not work, please select the phone call option and follow the directions. We hope that you will ask questions and our presenters will do their best to answer them as time allows. Click on the question block in the control panel and type in your questions. Please keep questions short and to the point. I'd also like to bring your attention about the handout for this webinar that can be found in the control console. You're welcome to view, download, or both slides of the webinar. Here's a bit about the Northeast Resource Recovery Association. We are a recycling nonprofit. We have 400 members, primarily municipalities, and we were funded nearly 40 years ago. So what do? We do cooperative marketing and purchasing. We enable communities to manage their own recycling programs and offer over 40 programs, including single stream and municipal solid waste. We connect sellers of recyclables to purchasers. We also provide education and technical assistance through workshops, facility tours, an annual conference, webinars like these, technical assistance, and a school club. And now I would like to introduce our speakers for today, Cassandra Hemenway, Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District, and Ollie Cultrara, former AmeriCorps Addison County Solid Waste Management District. On behalf of the NRRA, I would like to welcome you to the summer webinar series and turn the presentation over to you. Welcome, Cassandra and Ollie.
Thank you, Heather. This is Cassandra speaking. I'm going to start the webinar talking about what repair cafes are and why we might want to host them. And then Ollie will be joining me to go into a little bit more granular detail about running a repair cafe. Next slide, please. So I am going to start by talking about what a repair cafe is, and I will go into a little experience of our hosting repair cafes at the Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District. But I wanted to start with what is a repair cafe, because I learned that it's a fairly specific idea, but it's also flexible. So there's a general concept, and that gets implemented differently depending on who's organizing the cafe and where it is. So this is just a general concept, and it might look different depending where you are in the country or even across the globe. So they're essentially free meeting places, and they can happen anywhere where the community gathers. So a repair cafe could happen in a church basement, it could happen in a school, a senior center, a storefront. They happen where there's space and the appropriate electricity and Wi-Fi, but the basic tenet is that they're free. The fixers who are set up at repair cafes are volunteering their time. And people bring materials that need to be repaired based on the skills of the fixer. So it might be furniture, it might be electrical appliances, people might bring in clothing or jewelry. That all depends on what the fixers have volunteered for that particular event, and the person organizing the cafe or the people would be promoting those specific skills. The other thing that's really interesting about Repair Cafes is they were initiated by one person in 2007, Martine Postma in the Netherlands. And the concept just spread. People were hungry for it. So it's now an international movement. And Martine Postma formed the Repair Cafe Foundation in 2011, and they run the website repaircafe.org. And these two logos on the bottom are their logos. The one that's a little curlier is their older logo, and we included they rebranded recently. I included both because when we ran our Repair Cafes, they had the older logo. And part of what they do is they provide a template for how to run a Repair Cafe. And it's you do need to make a donation to the Repair Cafe Foundation to receive the template. And then part of that, the deal is that you have to put their logo on your materials. So that logo on the left is the one that we ended up using along with our own logo and our community partner logos. But without their template, it would have been hard for us to get started. And that includes templates for press releases, waivers, house rules, even data collection, all the way down to the exit survey. Next slide, please. So the other thing to think about is why have a Repair Cafe? And for my organization, the Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District, and I probably can speak for Ollie Cultrara, the organization they were the AmeriCorps person for. Solid waste management districts are focusing on reducing landfill waste. So teaching people and cultivating a culture of repair is a primary way to reduce waste. It gets people thinking about repair and making the most of what they have before they start thinking about recycling and landfill. Repair Cafes also pull together local resources, and those resources can be as varied as a community listserv to the space, the school or the senior center or wherever it's being held. And of course, all of the volunteers who give of their time. So we're pulling together all these community resources and actually building community in the process. And that's why people get really excited about them. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why they have spread across the globe since 2007. Next slide, please. So one of the bullet points in the last slide I didn't go into, but I'm going to talk about a little bit more, is the right to fix. It is a strange concept that we have to even, argue for a right to fix what we own, but that is the case. There are manufacturers that I'm quoting from repair.org right now, that website down at the bottom of the bullet point list, that they, whether inadvertently or intentionally, many manufacturers make it difficult or impossible for consumers to repair the items they buy. So there are organizations such as iFixit.com, repair.org, and many others that are working on the right to repair through legislation and policy. And iFixit.com was one of the go-to resources that we went to when organizing our Repair Cafe, and we noticed almost all of our fixers were using this resource as well while we were in the middle of the cafes, because they have a library of manuals and guidebooks for all kinds of materials. I mean, it's just endless. So you can go there, and if you don't have the manual for an item you need to fix, it's likely that iFixit will have it. They provide this manifesto that we actually printed out in poster size, and we posted at all of the cafes that we ran. And I like it because it's just engaging, and it really speaks to all of the reasons why you might think about repairing. And I really like that middle, that right at the top in the orange, it says, if you can't fix it, you don't own it. And that's part of that culture of repair I was talking about. The other part of the culture of repair is the concept of teaching and learning. So when you go to a repair cafe, you don't drop off your item and walk away. You sit down with the fixer. That's part of the whole process. And the fixer might have you, you know, taking something off with a screwdriver or participating in the repair. So you're not just having your item fixed, but you're learning about the process. You might not walk away as an experienced repair person, but you start to understand you know, some of the steps involved in repairing, and it gives you more confidence and empowerment to do that yourself later on. Next slide, please. So I also want to talk, this is a really simple slide, but the reason is because I really couldn't think of more to say here. In order to get started holding these cafes, we had to learn about how they work from other communities, starting with the Repair Cafe Foundation, but we also contacted communities all around New England that also held repair cafes. And we were lucky that it seems like it's, once people start doing it, they're very happy to share their knowledge. So we actually got on the phone and talked to people, sometimes for up to an hour, to just get some of the logistics and nitty-gritty details of how they ran their cafes. And what we learned was that concept is the same, but it gets implemented differently depending on, you know, the particulars of your community. We also got I'll talk about this in a minute, but we had an AmeriCorps member who helped us, and actually was her primary role was to organize these cafes. So having that person in place allowed us to have an extra person to contact these organizations with experience and reach out to partners. And I have a logo down at the bottom here that says Onion River Exchange. That was our primary partner for holding the 3 cafes that we ran. And we were very lucky that we did connect with them, because it turned out that their organizer actually lived in Germany and had attended and participated in quite a number of repair cafes and really thoroughly understood the concept. So our 2 organizations worked together with very different skill sets to hold these 3 events for our community. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to go into a little bit of detail about how we got started. And it's actually going back to the concept of knowledge sharing. I had heard about repair cafes for years before I learned what they actually looked like. So I had all these ideas in my head. But then the New York Department of Environmental Conservation did a Climate Smart Communities webinar series in 2017, and they held one about repair cafes. And I really got to hear about what it looked like on the ground. And then it became something that seemed really feasible. We are a solid waste management district, and so our staff we run on a very tight, streamlined budget, so we didn't have staff that could dedicate their time to this. But we did manage to get an AmeriCorps person. We had to write a grant and a program plan, but we did get an AmeriCorps person dedicated to this project, and that's her on the left, Kara Stapleford. So she was our Repair Cafe pioneer, and she was the person who did a lot of the reaching out to Repair Cafe International and some of the other organizations in our region that had run repair cafes. So that's one of the pieces that I think is key if you're thinking about running your own repair cafe, is making sure that you have somebody who can dedicate their time to it. It turned out that it was fairly time consuming in the organizing process, especially for that first one. Next slide, please. And I think one of the things that we did right was immediately reaching out to local partners. So I talked about Onion River Exchange. They became a formal partner of ours. We actually set up a memorandum of understanding, and we had a formal agreement about our roles. And then we were able to share the load for the organizing, and we all brought our different skills to it. And Onion River Exchange is a time bank. So, I mean, and that was a really great partner to have, because they have members who earn hours and share their hours. So we were able to tap into their membership for volunteers as well. A lot of these other logos you see on here were our other partners in different capacities. AmeriCorps for sure, because we had AmeriCorps members. There's the big sunflower logo was the senior center where we held one of our cafes. They weren't just a place that provided space, which is pretty big deal, but they also went to great lengths to promote the event, and some of their members ended up volunteering around, especially around the cafe side, providing food and running the cafe. The Center for an Agricultural Economy was an organization in one of our district towns that they didn't run the cafe, but they helped us find the space in their town and they helped us promote it locally. So that was the other piece, was having an organization that if it wasn't in the town where we were located, we needed somebody on the ground who could, knew the community. Without that, the cafe would fall on its face. And we did have that experience in a different town. We didn't have a partner and the cafe never happened. And then the last thing I want to mention, and this is Vermont specific, but that logo in the middle, Front Porch Forum, that is a Vermont specific listserv that provides a forum for every town and city in the state of Vermont. So this was essential for both Ollie and I in terms of getting the Repair Cafes, the information out to our communities when we were seeking volunteers and when we were promoting the events. Next slide. So the beginning steps that we went through, and again, I'm just going to talk about like the basic concept, and Ollie is about to tell you more about the granular level. But we, and this is similar to what I already discussed. So we reached out to other Repair Cafe organizers. We formed our partnerships. And then the big piece that took a lot of time that I would recommend thinking about thoroughly before getting started is finding a location. Our partner, Eric Bachman, and he's there in the gentleman in the middle with the flannel shirt. He was our partner from Onion River Exchange. He and Kara went to potential locations where we could hold a cafe, and they tested the electrical outlets and they tested the Wi-Fi and they measured the space. We needed to know that we had enough space for fixers and for the community to participate, parking. So they would go out and do site visits before we landed on the spaces that worked for us. And then the other piece that's a pretty big deal is the outreach plan or your communication. The Repair Cafe, once you have the organizing piece happening, the communication to the community is as much of a big deal as actually organizing the cafe. It doesn't happen if you don't recruit fixers. It doesn't happen if you don't recruit people to show up. And it's, if anybody here does outreach or marketing, you know what I'm talking about. You do need to have a plan in place for how you're going to reach out to people. And typically that would involve as many different places where people can hear about it as possible. So we reached out to newspapers. We wrote our own articles. We got some articles written about us. We invited the TV and radio to our first cafe. We used Front Porch Forum heavily. We had social media outreach. We connected with the email lists and the newsletters for the senior centers and some of the other community organizations. And that really helped get the word out. So I'm going to leave it here, and Ollie's going to go ahead and go into more detail about the organizing process.
Thanks, Cassandra. We can go to the next slide. This is Ollie Cultrara. I had been serving as the Eco AmeriCorps at the Addison County Solid Waste Management District. And as Cassandra mentioned, there's a lot of learning from other organizations. So when I joined the Solid Waste District, Central Vermont had already hosted a couple, and my predecessor, the AmeriCorps member before me, had also hosted one in Addison County in Middlebury. So I picked up from her, and as I learned as we went along, there's sort of a general 6-step process to organizing an event that you can kind of customize to whatever situation you find yourself in. So first was finding a place and time, and like Cassandra mentioned, scoping out electrical outlets and Wi-Fi and how much room there was and where there are going to be tables and chairs available. And then of course the time and day. And then once you have that picked out, you can start to recruit volunteers based on the time of the event. And so we should mention that a cafe makes it sound like it's a place that's open all the time, but we had organized them as sort of standalone events, but you could have it be a recurring, regular activity. So thinking about that in terms of your place as well. And then we started advertising. We based our advertisements on the list of volunteers that we were able to recruit and based on the skills and interests that they had. So when we asked them if they could participate, we asked them what they were good at fixing and used that to attract people. You can see in the advertisement on the right that we put out in the newspaper to let people know what kinds of things they could expect to bring and get fixed, of course with no guarantees. And then gathering the materials, including all the paperwork, things that are the paperwork and data collection materials are included in the Repair Café's template manual, and you could also customize them to your own event. We also gathered tools and supplies. We asked the volunteers what supplies and tools they would plan to bring and what they'd like us to supply. And we recruited donations for food. We solicited donations for some raffle prizes, tables and chairs, all the sort of nuts and bolts. And then hosting the event, I'll go through in a little more detail in the next several slides about the flow of the event. And then evaluating the results has also been really helpful because we did collect a lot of data during all of our events that sort of informed what we could do better and how we could better serve the community. Next slide, please. So the volunteers are the backbone of any sort of repair event. We have two main types of different volunteers, the fixers and sort of general event volunteers that can help staff your check-in and check-out table and help with food, things like that. The fixers are just skilled community members, either hobbyists or professionals, amateurs, enthusiasts in whatever area they are. Some folks are sort of all around, I'll fix anything kind of people, and some are very specific, like I'm a jewelry person or a sewer or a bike guy. So we cast our net as far and wide as we could. We recruited through Front Porch Forum, the newspaper, word of mouth, social media, and we found that booking more volunteers than we thought we needed would be helpful because sometimes things come up at the last minute and they have to cancel. And then once we had hosted one event, we had a list of people who were interested in volunteering again, and that was a great starting point, and some of them brought in people that they knew to kind of keep growing that list. We really wanted to keep them happy, so we made sure we fed them. We got them a gift card to a local business and allowed them to promote their business if they had one for repairing things. And definitely just keeping that relationship going because the demand for these events is so high, we don't want to burn them out. And also encouraging them to work together. They're just amateurs or, so it can be really helpful for them to know that they can collaborate with each other during the event and not have to feel like if they pick up something to fix that they're responsible for it only. And then I found that I was gathering quite a bit of information about the volunteers and their dietary needs and what they were bringing and what their skills were. So I made sure I had a spreadsheet and kept that all organized, but you can use whatever system of organization works for you. Next slide, please. So we definitely made sure that we had a waiver. The Repair Café template gives you a house rules thing that people can sign that kind of delineates what the expectations are. And mainly it's that there are no guarantees. You're not guaranteed to get your item fixed. You're also not guaranteed that it's not going to get even more broken. So just having people sign off to know that they're waiving liability for the volunteers so that if their item gets broken or doesn't get fixed, they can't be held responsible for that. And what the Central Vermont Solid Waste District did was print out the house rules poster, sort of blow it up on a tripod over here, and so people could see it as they came in, and then also handed them a letter-sized copy and have them sign it. The other thing is folks were allowed to bring items in one at a time because some people bring more than one item, and we want to be fair and help as many people as possible. So asking them to go to the end of the line for any subsequent items. And I can speak from experience in that when we didn't do that, people were a little bit upset that they were waiting longer because some folks brought more than one thing. And I think Cassandra has an example story of something that happened with a KitchenAid, a reason why you'd really want to have a house rules waiver.
Yeah, thank you, Ollie. This is actually a picture of the KitchenAid in the story. So this person brought in this KitchenAid to be repaired, and that was actually one of our board members. Not calling him out. He's a very talented and capable fixer. But in the process, KitchenAids are tricky. It turns out that you have to have specialized knowledge just to open up and get to the engine in a KitchenAid. But when he did do that, the machine actually broke further. It became more problematic than when the person brought it in. But they had seen the house rules poster. They had signed the waiver, so they knew that there was no liability, and they were very cheerful about it. They actually, it turned out, one of the hardware stores around the corner fixes KitchenAids, and we had actually done a little legwork to know that ahead of time. So they didn't get their KitchenAid fixed at our event, but we were able to connect them with a different repair option, and they were completely fine with that. And that also is another point, is to research where the hardware stores are and related to where you're holding your event, so you can get people to them if they need to pick up a part or have any other need related to the fix at the event.
Great, thanks. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about how the event can be laid out and how the people can move through it. And this is just one option, and we kind of tweaked it over time over our multiple events that we held, and you can kind of customize it to your space and what works for you and your volunteers. So we definitely appreciated having a check-in table. We had lines out the door when we opened our events both times, so it was nice to have a place for them to come in and get an explanation of what was happening. This is where they read the house rules and sign the waiver, including a media waiver stating that we could take their picture and use it. And so we took lots of pictures and used this to promote future events. So definitely a really good thing to include. I'm not sure if that was included in the Repair Cafe's manual, so you might want to add that yourself. And then we also learned from Central Vermont about the routing slip option, which is where they write down what their item is and what's wrong with it, and then they bring it to the next table. Next slide, please. Called the routing table. So we also learned from Central Vermont that weighing the items allowed us to get a total weight of the materials that we kept out of the landfill by fixing them. So that was just an interesting piece of data collection we chose to do, definitely optional. But we wrote the weight down on the routing slip, and then had the person leave their item in the routing slip that had their name on it. In lines, basically this table was serving as a queue, and then when a volunteer fixer was available to come do the next item, they would come up to the table, and trying to manage keeping them in as much of chronological order as possible, they would choose the next item that they were able to fix. And so then they'd call out the name on the routing slip and then go over to their fixing table. Next slide, please. So the repair tables, each fixer got their own table and got to set up their tools and had a chair for the fixer and then a chair for the participants. And as much as possible, we were encouraging our attendees to participate as the fixer was repairing their item. So it's a great learning opportunity and can be really empowering. So an experience I had bringing a lamp to a repair cafe, the fixer said to me, "Here's what I'm thinking we should do. Why don't you start unscrewing the switch and I'll watch and let you know if you're doing anything wrong." And I found that really empowering because it wasn't something that I would have thought to do because I thought he was going to fix it, but it really helped me sort of learn and build the confidence that it's something I could try myself at home. So again, it's not a drop-off repair service. We really do want people to be there, even if they're not participating, just to watch, because it's important to have a conversation throughout the process, checking in to make sure that whatever the fixer is going to try is okay with the owner. So if they say, you know, I think I need to open up this panel here, I'm not really sure how that works, and if I don't want to crack it, but maybe I might need to pry a little bit, is it okay if I try that? And they can say yes or no, depending on what they're comfortable with. Next slide, please. So after the item is either fixed or not, a homework sheet is available for next steps. It's just a little slip of paper that the fixers can write on there what parts they might need to go get, or where some other repair service that might be available if they weren't able to fix it right on the spot. Definitely was a really useful tool was that homework sheet. And some fixers, even out of the kindness of their heart, said, you know, I can't fix this here, but I know if I like spent some more time on it or have a special tool at home that I'd be able to fix it. So they would take it home and work on it later, and having the homework sheet to be able to coordinate the contact information for that was helpful. And some fixers were able to give out their contact info and business cards at this point to connect for further or future repair services, sometimes for pay. We were totally fine with that. And then later after events, sometimes we, the organizers, would get contacted, like, I missed the event, but I have a broken item. Do you know someone who could fix it? So we made sure to check with our volunteers whether they would be open to being contacted after the event about potential other fixes, which does drum up some business for them if they do it for pay. And we also found that we could do a little bit of research and published a list of repair services and repair people in our area so that people could have a resource to take home with them. Next slide, please. We've also, over our several events and over the Central Vermont events, we've offered some various other activities for people to participate in while they wait. So we've had lots of success with our Take Apart table, which is a table staffed with an adult volunteer for supervision and basically just broken electronics that kids or anyone else who's interested are invited to come disassemble and see how they work and see what's inside. We also have had resource tables with books about repair and printouts of repair guides from ifixit.com to give people a sense of what materials are out there for their own learning. Arts and crafts, just some pipe cleaners and drawing and coloring supplies. And then there was even a massage therapist at one of the Central Vermont Repair Cafes helping to fix people in addition to stuff. Next slide. So data collection is a big part of the event. It's kind of built into the paperwork that the Repair Cafe manual suggests that you use. The routing slip is helping you collect data on what the items are, what categories they're in, you know, how much they weigh, whether they got fixed or not. And so while it can be tedious and overwhelming, we did find it was useful to gather that data to get an idea of how to best plan our next event. For instance, we found that there were very few bikes that were brought in, and so we didn't necessarily need to have a bike fixer at a winter event, for example, when people aren't really thinking about biking. And it also helped us report on our successes to the board of our organization and in our newsletter to the public to let them know how popular the event was. Next slide, please. So Cassandra can jump in here in a minute, but we found that food was really helpful, and we had a similar approach both times, I think, for both organizations to entice people with food. Go ahead, Cassandra.
So yeah, thanks, Ollie. I wanted to just mention that we haven't really talked about the cafe piece of the Repair Cafe, but that's a very important element, and I would not hold a Repair Cafe without it, because the whole concept is building community and coming together, and the cafe is the place where people socialize a little bit and while they're waiting, and they run into people they know, all those things we remember from before the global pandemic. But at all of our cafes, we made sure we had 2 or 3 tables that remained empty, so near the food table, and people used them, and it really did become like a real cafe. This was a place where people who wanted to participate as volunteers who didn't have fixing skills could volunteer. We had people who would just keep the space organized and clean and bring out the new food when the old food was running low. And one of the things we did in our organizing process was get donations of food from local bakeries and grocery stores, and we got coffee donations. We did also have to buy some things ourselves, and that's why you see a donation bucket in the middle of the food table. We did add a donation bucket near the food and also near our check-in table where we had it close to where we did our exit surveys, because people like having the opportunity to give back, and sometimes it was $1, sometimes it was more, and it was never a huge amount of money that we collected in the donations, but it would allow us to buy those food or consumable supplies that we would need for repairs for the next cafe. And then the other piece we did was we actually got enough donations of food so that we could have a meal for all the fixers before the event started. So we started our events at around, I can't remember if it was noon or 1 in the afternoon, but so we would have a time when the fixers could sit down and have a real meal before we got started. And that was part of the whole food and cafe part of the event. Next slide.
So we didn't provide food for the fixers before the event, but we did make sure that they had a meal during the event, because I think both of our events kind of happened over an evening meal time. Although some of them got so excited that they didn't even want to stop to eat. So now we can move on to the next slide. Thanks. So now we're going to move into what worked well and what sort of lessons we each learned and things that we would do differently if we started again. So things that worked well was encouraging participants to bring their own replacement parts if they knew what they needed. For example, a clasp for a necklace or a socket for a lamp. That really helped, because a lot of the times what happens at the Repair Cafe is a diagnosis where the fixer says, oh, here's what you need, but you're gonna have to go get it. And Cassandra mentioned that they purposely timed their events to be when the local hardware stores were open, so people could potentially go out and come back and bring the replacement part. But as much as possible, when people brought their own parts, it really helped make sure things could get fixed on the spot and not require some later work. The cafe area, again, really important, because sometimes we had long lines and it was nice for people to have a place to sit and relax and enjoy some food and socialize. We also appreciated the data collection that we did, although it was somewhat tedious. It was really helpful to get a sense of how successful we were, especially because as the organizers, we were busy overseeing the event and making sure people knew where to go and getting them what they needed during the event. So we weren't able to get a good sense just by observation of what was coming in and what was getting fixed. So having the paperwork afterward to see that was really helpful. And then we took as many pictures as we could, lots of pictures, and those are helpful for doing things like presentations afterward, but mostly just for promoting future events by showing how successful your past ones have been. Next slide, please.
So what worked for the Central Vermont Solid Waste Management Cafe is very similar to what Ollie spoke about. Also, I felt that reaching out to other Repair Cafe organizers in other areas of the country was hugely helpful for us. Learning from others, that knowledge sharing we talked about. And I believe we did that with Ollie's organization too. So it's one of those pay it forward things that turns around very quickly. As soon as we held one cafe, a bunch of other organizations were wondering how to hold them. Also, developing those community partners was key to the success of our cafes. We got to the point where, as we would plan future cafes, we just wouldn't even do it if we didn't have a community partner working with us. Spending the time on scoping out those locations was also something that really worked, so that when we actually were in place holding the cafe, we knew exactly what we could expect with the electricity and the Wi-Fi in the space. Also, spending the time reaching out to media outlets and getting some articles before the event and photos during the event really worked, because it got excitement in the community going. We also, I didn't mention this earlier, but for our final cafe that we held, we put together a community committee. We called it the Central Vermont Repair Cafe Committee, and it was made up of ourselves, another organization, Onion River Exchange, and some community members who just had an interest. So instead of just having our organization or a partner organization, we put together a group that so we could spread it around and maybe get other people in the community excited about organizing their own cafes. And then we talked about this earlier, but having that waiver in place is essential. That you can call it the house rules or the waiver, but really emphasizing that that not just handing it to people to sign, but explaining verbally what's in it and having that poster-sized version of it really made sure that people understood what it was about. Next slide.
So some lessons learned from the Addison County Solid Waste District. We were a little overwhelmed, or I was at least, by the amount of paperwork we were asking the participants and the volunteers to fill out during the event. So I did attempt to transfer some of that data collection onto Google Forms and have a laptop for people to check in with, but that did not work. People looked at the laptop and kind of froze and didn't know what to do. So luckily, we had backup paperwork just printed out. So I would just know your demographic. We did find that lots of folks coming to our events were older and were maybe not as tech savvy, and so I think the paper versions were a little bit more user friendly for them. And then we also had a couple times where fixers canceled at the last minute, which meant that we had only a few people trying to serve a lot of interest, and we had long wait times because of that. And people were generally fairly good natured about waiting, but just knowing that it's better to err on the side of overbooking your volunteers so you have more than enough, just because these events can be super popular, which was really encouraging, but we just wanted to make sure that we could meet the need. Next slide, please.
So lessons learned for us at the Central Vermont Solid Waste District is one of the things we thought that would work that didn't is we wanted to provide the repair cafes and simultaneously work with other organizations with a goal of having them take on the organizing role into the future. And that's one of the reasons we formed that Central Vermont Repair Cafe committee. That didn't end up happening. Once we got out of it, they kind of fizzled out. I mean, there were a couple that happened peripherally, but there hasn't been another organization that's taken it on. And the other thing is that once we started holding them, people looked to us to continue holding them. And we, as an organization, this isn't technically in our mission, so it's hard for us to justify the staff time and the resources to continuing to organize them. So we have struggled with trying to get other organizations motivated. We do have a website, cvswmd.org, that's at the end of the slideshow also, where we have a whole Repair Cafe section, and we have all of the resources that we developed through the Repair Cafe organization. We took those and made them more relevant for our region, and we provide those for free, and we have a whole resource on our website for anybody who wants to start a Repair Cafe. The other thing that we started with was no budget. We thought we could just do this all with volunteers and our AmeriCorps person, but there really are things that you need to buy. I mean, things that I didn't even think about, like we ended up buying some rubber mats to put on the tables, because a lot of the tables we used were belonged to the organization that hosted us. So the rubber mats were put down so that the tables didn't get damaged, and screws and other pieces and parts didn't roll off. There were consumables like WD-40 and small hardware that we provided. And of course, filling in the gaps for food if not all the food or drinks for the cafe are donated. Having a small budget for that. I think even with just a couple $100, that's enough to get that stuff together for a cafe. The other thing that I think I wouldn't do in the future is formalize the community partnerships. We had our MOUs, and that was good for clarifying our roles and really solidified our partnerships, but it also ended up locking us in and not allowing for as much flexibility as we wanted. So as much as I really believe in forming those partnerships, I'm not sure they necessarily have to be formal with actual written agreements in every case. The other thing is around communicating. When you're working with other organizations or people, everybody communicates differently. So having that conversation early on about expected turnaround time when you send an email, or preference for phone, email, or text, all of that stuff can get frustrating if you don't understand how the other person communicates. So that's something I would work on more with future community partners. And then the other piece that isn't on this list was that we, as our organization, was able to provide liability insurance wherever we held our cafes. But once we weren't involved, that became an issue. If somebody wanted to hold a cafe, sometimes finding that liability insurance or finding an organization that can provide it can be a challenge. Next slide.
So future directions, we were thinking about this even before the pandemic hit, but it's even more relevant now. So we found there was a large demand and people were asking us, when's the next one? These should be monthly or even weekly. And we thought, whoa, that's a lot. It's a lot of work to organize. And so thinking about how these kinds of services and events and community engagement can happen on a more regular basis, we thought about potentially having smaller, more frequent events. For example, just doing one particular type of item at a time, a sewing night and then a bike night and then an appliance night. We also played with the idea of pre-registering attendees to get a sense of who would be coming and what supplies we would need and what kind of items people were trying to get fixed to maybe focus our volunteer recruitment more on those areas. But we also didn't want to lock people into a time to show up. But if you were trying to host an event in the time of COVID where you're trying to keep people spaced out, it might be useful to register people for a specific time to allow for space and distance. Repair and diagnostic tutorial videos, we've thought about, folks could make those or stream them live to teach people about sort of the general principles of repair and not just how do you fix this one specific issue, but how do you think about diagnosing an appliance, for example? What are you looking for? What's the thought process involved in that? Because that was one of the skill sets that some of our volunteers sort of were expressing interest in spreading to the community, something that would be applicable to lots of different people and lots of different types of items that they could pass on because they felt like not everybody has that skill. Outdoor events are certainly a possibility. We had a local farmers market get in touch with us about trying to host a small event at their farmers market, which didn't end up happening, but certainly with electricity and Wi-Fi and a tent and a table, it's a possibility, or live online workshops. And I think Cassandra has on the next slide about resources, some information about something like that that's already happening. So next slide, please.
Yeah, there's this organization, it's the fixitclinic.org, that third bullet point down. They really stepped up to the plate during COVID and they started focusing on fixing medical equipment and also like publicly owned items. And they are also doing virtual repair clinics on Zoom. So they just they already existed, but when COVID came, they really just started doing everything online and focusing on the needs in the community. RepairCafe.org is a really, really helpful resource. That's the one that Martine Postma organized, and that's sort of the original Repair Cafe concept. I think even if you don't want to use that exact model, at least looking through their website and at some of their resources might be a good idea. And you can get your Repair Cafe listed on their website. These events happen all over the world, and it's kind of neat. I'm not sure if it really attracts local traffic, but it's kind of cool to see your event. And I actually looked up, our old events are still up there. iFixit.com is that website that has the repair manifesto and the manuals and guidebooks for countless items and much more. It's a really great resource for repair people and lay people. They sell specialized toolkits for things like opening up and fixing smartphones and all kinds of other things that require very specialized tools. Our own website, cvswmd.org/Repair Cafe Toolkit, is where we offer our resources that we developed through our experience running these repair cafes, and they're all free downloads, and you're welcome to peruse those pages and take what you need out of it. And then, of course, repair.org. That is the organization that is really focused on legislation and policy around the right to repair. And even if you just take 15 minutes and go to their website and read that policy page, it really gives a great overview of the kind of challenges that we as consumers are facing around manufacturers creating products that are difficult or impossible to repair, or sometimes they even claim copyright infringement when people try to repair their items. So we have some great organizations that are working. There's over 20 states currently that have considered right to repair legislation, And I think it's something we're going to see more and more of. And I encourage folks to get involved in that if you can find the right avenue. So I think that's all for resources. We're ready for the next slide where we can take some questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cassandra and Ollie, for that wonderful presentation. I know a couple of questions that I had, one that you already answered, which was, hey, have you thought about having virtual repair cafes during this time? And clearly you have. So that would be a great resource for folks. Another question I had personally, I have a concern with my refrigerator. And I was like, well, I can't take my refrigerator to a repair cafe. But are there examples of folks who, you know, they can't bring the item in because of size or et cetera, but maybe they bring in pictures or describe, you know, so you have folks that come in looking for advice without the actual object?
This is Cassandra. I'll take that one. I would say, I think Ollie should answer for their experience, but in our experience, we really did have to limit size just because of the nature of the event. But it is a really good place to meet people who do repair. So even if you can't bring your refrigerator in, you can go and talk to the fixers and get their card and connect with them later. And that's the way we would handle something like that.
Sure.
Yeah, we didn't have to put a specific limit on size because people just didn't want to bring in large items because they had to have to drag it in themselves. We were surprised by a couple pieces of furniture that people managed to bring in. But one thing that we did do was doing some research of our own to put together a list of repair services, and we found some that included people in the community who could repair things like refrigerators. And also, we're just so lucky in Vermont to have Front Porch Forum. Lots of people are constantly posting on there things like, I'm looking for someone to repair this. Do you have any recommendations? Or posting recommendations. So, you know, tapping into your local social media or other sort of more nationwide websites that are about service providers could be really helpful.
Excellent. Well, I learned so much today. I have had a clock repaired at a local cafe here in New Hampshire, so I do know the positive you know, action that could come from those. I also wanted to mention to folks, if they're still handing in their questions at the end here, we have an upcoming webinar that deals with extended producer responsibility when you're talking about, you know, making products that aren't fixable or you can't get to them. We're having that on August 26th. That's at noon. So it's Wednesday at noon. That's a special time for that particular Wednesday. So if you're interested in that area, feel free to sign up for that webinar. And I'm just waiting to see if I see any other questions coming in from folks listening now. But what a wealth of resources. I want to thank you and appreciate so much what you've put together for us this afternoon. And yes, so I will go and thank our sponsors for this webinar. We have the Interstate Refrigerant Recovery Incorporated, Schnitzer, and the USDA. I want to remind everyone to take a survey at the end of the webinar. It will launch immediately at the end of this webinar, as well as a message in your email tomorrow as a reminder in case you didn't take it today. We welcome feedback. Our webinar series will continue on Wednesday, August 12th. We'll explore Educate, Don't Contaminate with Lucy Perkins and Matt Grondin from EcoMaine. And then on Friday, August 14th, we will examine medical waste, needles, pharmaceuticals, vaping, and more with Cindy Sterling, Grants Manager at NRRA, Paige Wilson, Solid Waste Manager and Assistant Grant Manager at Lakes Region Planning Commission, and Ben Parham, Education Assistant at NRRA. I want to thank you all again for attending and have a happy summer.